Hey, Dr. C here with you. Let's talk all about turmeric today. I'm really excited to go deep into this one. This is a cool spice I've used forever, and there's been lots and lots of data coming out about it. But there's some different perspectives that have emerged, and I wanted to share that with you and give you some confidence in how you could make use of it in your own life. So, quick overview of things that I'll cover. Great stuff to use in cooking. No drawbacks, no negatives. I'll even give you a recipe to play with for that purpose. And supplements of turmeric might be useful for depression, for fatty liver, for lowering inflammation. Curcumin supplements, on the other hand, not too sure about. Okay, so let's go deep in the story. For starters, where did this stuff come from? Where did it start being used? You know, I've been a fan of Ayurvedic medicine for a long time, before I was in medical school, and boy, they were forerunners on so many things. And this is just one more example of that. There's talk in literature about, as far back as 4000 BCE, this stuff being used in Indian cuisine. And I've seen some documented evidence of recovered pots from about 2500 BC that were stained with turmeric. So it's definitely been used there for quite a while. It made its way more slowly to Africa, first East Africa, then West, Europe next up, and then finally over to the New World. But this was more so within the last several hundred years, so much more recent. And a couple of quick early discussions too. I want to talk a little bit about like fresh and dried, the differences, how you think about one or the other in the kitchen. As a generality, you think about a 3-to-1 volume ratio. So for every 3 teaspoons of fresh grated turmeric, you'd be using about 1 teaspoon of dried turmeric. So other than that, what's the difference? I'm really glad I did this video for you and did this research on this stuff. I had been always buying fresh turmeric. And the drawback is you got to buy a lot usually. And it doesn't really have all that much of a shelf life. And you never use it all that fast, so you waste quite a bit. So then the solution that I found was keeping it frozen. And yeah, it kind of works. You take it out, you use a planer, a microplaner, and you can grate stuff off of it. It does work. You make a heck of a mess along the way. In researching this blog, I read a lot of taste tests, a lot of blind taste tests that chefs did. You can't tell the difference if it's cooked. If you're talking about a cooked dish, any cooked application for turmeric, no one can tell the difference. Like the best chefs can't tell the difference, and I know that I couldn't. If it is in a raw form, and that's pretty much just adding it to smoothies, I wouldn't consume a lot of it in a raw form in smoothies. You're gonna stain your teeth. You're gonna stain things. It's kind of messy that way. But I have noticed a taste difference if you're playing with like a little dab of the raw or a little bit of the dried. You can taste a difference that way. But once it's cooked, you can't. Funny story, one of the first times I was playing with fresh turmeric, it looks a lot like ginger, maybe a little bit, smaller, more shriveled roots. Once you cut into it though, it's more the color of carrot. It's not quite the color of powdered turmeric, it's more like carrot color. And it's very mild in taste. And so one of the first few times I used it, I just chewed on it. I just ate some of it. And it's mild enough to where you can get away with that. But then you go look at your teeth and they're flipping yellow. It stains things so badly. So yeah, I saw a lot of taste tests, and just as important, if not more important, lots of data about its benefits and the various constituents and their stability, their bioavailability or whatnot. I can't think of any good reason to use fresh turmeric anymore. So there seems like something, like it's like next level or you're superior for using it over the dried. But it tastes the same, it has the same biological effects. This stuff is a whole lot easier to use, truth be told. It's nice to cook it by itself for a little bit or with other spices, which is the best way to use it. So I'll often cook it by itself. And it doesn't have an indefinite shelf life either. And you can find some versions of it in the store that are due to be thrown out. The color is already off and the taste is not great. So get a fresh version of it and don't keep it forever. You can keep it frozen if you go through it pretty slowly. I'll give you more of a shelf life for that. Just take it out and it's not really used differently when it's frozen. But yeah, I see no advantage not to use dried turmeric in the future. So in the diet, the amounts that we would use, the combinations we would use, there's really no drawbacks and no concerns, no contraindications. It doesn't really matter about age, pregnancy, lactation. Can't find any data about it being harmful in any of those circumstances when it's used in the diet in amounts to be normally used within foods. So not like mainlining the stuff, not using massive amounts of it, but food versions of it are completely safe. Now, supplemental forms of turmeric, they're different, and most supplements are really curcumin extracts. We'll talk more about that distinction, but overall, these higher concentrates, these supplemental forms, we don't know that they are safe for pregnancy or lactation. And since we don't know that they are, we are always cautious and we avoid their use in women who are pregnant or lactating. They may have effects on delaying coagulation. They can make your blood clot more slowly. That's a big deal pre or post surgery, or if you're on anticoagulant medications. They may also have a hypoglycemic effect. And funny thing, it's talked about as a bug or a side effect, and I'd argue that's more of a benefit. In most cases, having your fasting glucose level lower, that's a good thing. The only real pitfall is those who are on blood sugar lowering medications, there may be some additive effect with turmeric that causes the medications to have too much of a blood lowering effect. And there are a fair number of medications in which it could theoretically interact with because of the effects that it has on phase 1 liver enzymes. So if you're on some meds for some ongoing reason, check with your doctor, check with your pharmacist, because this could be a negative factor. Turmeric supplements, especially curcumin supplements, could be a problem. So what do we know that turmeric can help with? It's been studied for so many things, and if I were to ramble off all the things it's been studied on, there wouldn't be much that's left out. You can find studies on turmeric in almost any condition you can imagine. But that doesn't mean that it's helped in all those cases. A lot of those studies showed that it didn't work, it had no effects, or they were studies that were a type of data we really couldn't put much weight on. They were preliminary, they were test tube studies, they were animal studies, they weren't controlled. So yeah, a lot of things that are speculative, and let's just kind of put those over here. So here I'll talk about the things we've got pretty solid evidence on. So one of which is allergic rhinitis, classic runny nose due to allergies. So the use of turmeric, probably both dietary and supplemental, may be a really positive factor for benefiting those issues. And we think the mechanisms are through reduction of inflammation and then also stabilization of mast cells. And perspective on that, things that work in those ways, they often do take at least several weeks to start having a clear effect. So this is not like a spray and you feel better instantly, but no, it can take a little while, but often quite helpful for chronic allergic rhinitis. And you could extrapolate from that, there may be benefit from other chronic excess histamine conditions, because that's really what's driving allergies. So one of the things that I wasn't as clear on is that there's a fair body of evidence for turmeric being useful for depressive symptoms. And some studies were looking at its use all by itself. Other studies were looking at its use when used in conjunction with antidepressant medication, those that were on meds but not getting a good enough response. And the amount, the actual effect size in terms of someone's depressive index score, how much did that shift? It was pretty dramatic. It was more than we would generally see from medications. And we also saw that many that had ongoing anxiety symptoms also saw some pretty marked benefit from turmeric in the studies. High triglycerides. Pretty interesting thing. Also some possible benefits for decreasing total cholesterol. That's not quite as solid, but pretty consistent effects for reducing overall triglycerides. And related to that, fatty liver. Pretty good data on that. There was actually a really nice placebo study, and they showed that the amount of fat in the liver could be reduced by about 43% with just the use of supplemental turmeric extracts. They also saw that in those populations, the main liver enzymes, the ALT, AST scores went down significantly, the long-term blood sugar A1C improved, and total cholesterol also improved. Then we've got a fair amount of data on arthritis. We've got different forms of that. We've got rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. We've got different joints that are involved. Probably the most specific data we have is on knee osteoarthritis. So chronic knee pain due to degenerative as opposed to inflammatory arthritis. Turmeric may be a helpful thing for that. And again, quite safe, barring some medications and some population risks. And as far as a big category, last up would be some versions of chronic itching. And I don't know, I'm putting these in to be complete because there has been some clear benefit shown for turmeric for chronic pruritus, as we would call that. However, it was pretty specific in that it was for patients with chronic kidney disease and symptoms of pruritus secondary to dialysis treatment or after mustard gas exposure. So good to know. If you are concerned about mustard gas exposure, you may wish to carry some turmeric with you. You may be less itchy after such exposure. So whatever that's worth, there you go. So then we think about to supplement with it. What are the forms available? Well, there's a lot of them out there. There's just crude powder. A lot of supplements are nothing different than this stuff just put into capsules. And some people even do that by themselves. There are various turmeric extracts. There is tincture of turmeric available, which is basically these roots soaked in an alcohol extract and then the alcohol used for medication. And then there's a lot of modified extracts. So we see a lot of trends in supplements, and a big trend in turmeric is how do we make you absorb it better? And there's been all these different versions. We have nanoparticles, we have phytosomes, we have various ways that it's allegedly changed to make you absorb it better. And I've called these the absorption wars. And so companies will compete upon what percent of curcumin they claim is absorbed from their product. So let's talk about that. Do you need to absorb it? You could almost assume that that would be a critical thing, that you've got to absorb it and get it in your bloodstream. What we put in our mouth and we ingest, it's not really in our body until we absorb it, till we assimilate it. Until then, it's just passing through. It'll interact with our gut, but it won't really go through our organs. And we've seen so many studies showing that populations that consume a lot of turmeric have these various beneficial effects from that. They have healthier outcomes in certain ways. And so then, we saw these good benefits in populations. People started doing tests in laboratories, and they found that one of the main alkaloids in turmeric, curcumin, that in a test tube, it inhibits inflammatory enzymes. It does a lot of things that seem to be really useful. But then they look at curcumin and they say, hey, that's the active ingredient, but when someone consumes turmeric, you can look at how much curcumin enters their bloodstream. And it's pretty much none. Curcumin is really not absorbed. It doesn't come into our bloodstream when we consume turmeric. So that's been the conundrum. And the thought has been, there must be some way that, if you've got a lot of it in food, maybe if it's mixed with various foods, maybe if you're having it often, that somehow some gets in. No one's really explained that. But they see that, curcumin, they've assumed that was the main helpful part, but that definitely does not absorb. So bioavailability has been thought to be the big barrier. And companies have taken that first principle, that idea that curcumin is what matters and that it has to be absorbed to work. And they keep hacking and tweaking and adjusting to try to get curcumin better absorbed. So what happens when that's done? Well, they found that if you isolate curcumin and you add a compound called piperine. Now, kind of a cool thing, I mentioned how turmeric's been used forever in Ayurveda. So piperine, there's a plant called Piper nigrum, which is pipali, and this is white pepper. Piper longum, and this is long pepper, which is there's black pepper, long pepper, and white pepper, right? So Piper nigrum is black pepper, so Piper longum is the long pepper, and that one's very dense in an alkaloid called piperine, and that's been found to help make some things absorb better. So researchers showed that turmeric with piperine could cause more curcumin to enter the bloodstream. So manufacturers took that data and ran with that. They made some concentrates of curcumin that had piperine added to them. Well, there have been case reports now, there have been multiple case reports in which curcumin with piperine has actually led to autoimmune hepatitis. So this is the nastiest condition. When I practiced, there was at least a couple times where I did diagnose that patients developed autoimmune hepatitis. The first one, it was a woman who was on longer-term antibiotic treatment for arthritis. There was a theory that antibiotics could work really well for that. I've not really followed that industry, but one of the complications of one of the more common antibiotics is autoimmune hepatitis. Thankfully, she was all right. We did catch the condition, stop the medication, manage the whole process early enough, but about half of those who get autoimmune hepatitis, they don't survive. It's a big deal. And yeah, there have been many case reports of highly absorbed curcumin extracts giving rise to this. The other thing along the lines, if you could absorb it really well, what would be the ultimate version of that? And so many took that same first principle thought of, okay, curcumin's the secret sauce of turmeric, but you've got to get it in your system in some way. Let's go straight in your bloodstream. So there were doctors who were giving IV curcumin. And yeah, if those first principles were valid, I could see how that would make sense, but there was a tragic death from the use of that. And it turned out that the compounded intravenous curcumin didn't really even have curcumin. That was, at first we thought curcumin was harmful by itself, and that was plausible based upon its poor absorption, the autoimmune hepatitis. But as that case was investigated fully, they found that there was a fair amount of polyethylene glycol that ended up in the compounded medication, but there was less than 1% of the labeled amount of curcumin. So I'm just going to make up a number. So say that it said that it had 10 milligrams of curcumin per mil of solution, it only had 1/100th of a part of curcumin per mil of solution. So yeah, it was not really made right. And I'm always wary about compounded medications because there's not a lot of checks and balances. Now I would say that compounded topical hormones, pretty safe, pretty easy things to make, not really case reports of big mishaps. But past that area, when we're talking about injectables or we're talking about thyroid medications, yeah, not a fan of compounded things. So then we've had data showing that the piperine, the IV versions are not safe. Well, then what about the whole nanoparticles, phytosomes, and all this stuff? Well, there have been some studies showing that low amounts of curcumin that are absorbed, like if they're given in whopping amounts and people get a little bit in their bloodstreams, that some low threshold may be safe, but we just don't have much data around that. And there's this whole new model emerging. So what we're seeing now from the next generation of research, people have gone back and said, hey, we've got to revisit those first principles. Maybe the benefit is not from getting curcumin into your bloodstream. Maybe there's something else that turmeric does in the intestinal tract. Because now we've got data showing that you could have changes in the intestinal tract that don't involve anything deeper in your body that could still give a lot of those benefits to managing inflammation and benefiting the immune response. And that's this new emerging model. So we're seeing that turmeric and its effects on the intestinal tract may do some pretty cool stuff. So it can change our more powerful internal antioxidant pathways like NRF2. We also know that NF-kappa beta and COX enzymes, many metalloproteinases, these are all things that are working throughout the body based upon what's occurring in the intestinal tract. We also see that in the gut, turmeric can have effects upon natural killer cell activity. It can also benefit toll-like receptor 4. It can diminish lipopolysaccharide responses. It can diminish cytokine release. It can improve tight junctions. Lots and lots of big benefits. But these are things that we're seeing in the gut, and more so from turmeric. So I've not jumped into the whole bandwagon of the curcumin absorption wars because I wasn't certain about those first principles being valid, and more emerging data is questioning that they're probably not valid. But I do think we're seeing more data about the whole plant being relevant. And there's newer compounds now that are called CTM, or complete turmeric matrix. These are really cool because they're not trying to hack ways to cram more curcumin in your bloodstream. They're ways to better mimic the effects of the entire plant of turmeric upon your intestinal tract. So it's a really full spectrum of the biologically active compounds. And it seems that most of these benefits that emerge from that relate to the reduction of inflammation and the ways in which your gut regulates inflammation elsewhere throughout your body. And we're seeing too that the full spectrum of compounds, not just curcumin, but all these curcuminoids, these sesquiterpenoids, turmeric proteins, volatile oils, things like turmerone, allantoin, zingaberone, curidione, and germacarone, there's some way these things together work more than just one isolate does by itself. And that's pretty intuitive. That's what we see with whole foods in general. So now the idea is not so much what's the bioavailability, all those hard words left me stumbling on an easy word. So not so much what's the bioavailability, not so much how much turmeric can you cram in your bloodstream, but what's the bioefficacy? So what happens when you ingest that? Not do you change the blood level of curcumin, but do you change your systemic level of inflammation? Do you actually see beneficial effects? And that's the bioefficacy. And we now know that it's more important to look at what happens throughout your whole body than just how much curcumin gets crammed in your bloodstream. And the exciting thing we're seeing is that these complete turmeric matrices, they can have dramatic effects on measured inflammation in markers like C-reactive protein, SED rate, also in white counts, in just a few weeks. The body can change really quickly in these better circumstances. So what to do with turmeric? Well, if you were to think about supplemental turmeric, I would encourage a complete turmeric matrix. I would not encourage plain turmeric in capsules, and I wouldn't encourage curcumin extracts. In terms of using that, the complete turmeric matrix, the research on it was also pretty cool because it wasn't whopping doses. You weren't just taking a lot of this stuff. Most studies were on just one capsule once a day, and that could be taken with food. Now, you wouldn't take that at the same time as thyroid medication, which is true of any other pill. And the best documented indications for once daily use would be for chronic depression or anxiety, high triglycerides, or fatty liver syndrome. Now, in more acute inflammatory states, it's reasonable to consider that twice daily, so one capsule twice daily with food. And those states would include generalized chronic inflammation, as like soft tissue pain or joint pains, especially if we're seeing like arthritis, especially like osteoarthritis, especially of the knee, allergic rhinitis, itching. So remember, mustard gas. Next time you get sprayed with mustard gas, you got an answer for that. But no, seriously, there may be some versions of chronic urticaria, not from mustard gas, that it could be helpful for. So those would be useful ways to consider supplemental turmeric, but I would definitely add turmeric into your cooking if you don't already. And yeah, fresh is cool. Fresh is kind of like hip and sexy, and like it seems like you're going above and beyond, but it's got a short shelf life, it's kind of messy, and it's not superior in terms of taste or health properties if you're talking about cooked dishes. Once you're talking about raw dishes, perhaps subtle taste difference, but otherwise not so much. So what do you use this stuff with? Anytime you'd be using black pepper, ginger, it's a great place for turmeric. Anytime you'd use garlic, turmeric can go really well with that. And then also a lot of things that are more sweet, like cinnamon type dishes, turmeric goes really well with that too. Baked vegetables, it's a great combination, especially ones that already have that kind of a color profile. So like sweet potatoes, squash, carrots, works really well in those. Split pea soup, chicken soups, awesome with that. Cooked greens, of course curries. This is like a core part of curry in general. And I'll be sure to include a couple recipes too. I love making golden milk with curry, with turmeric. You'll see a lot of versions of that, but I like one that is rich in flavor, but not a whole lot of just empty calories. So here's an easy one you can make with some unsweetened flax milk. Turmeric is great with that, and I use some ginger with it as well. Another one that I love a lot is using this with hot cereal. And you can do a lot of different hot cereals, but oats are such a good fit. And any version of oats work, but steel cut works really nice for pairing with turmeric. And this is a way where you can combine that with cinnamon. If you want to go really wild, you can throw some cardamom in there too and get a phenomenal combination. And yeah, great way to get a start for the day with a nice anti-inflammatory effect. And last one, I'll put one in for a turmeric iced tea. And this is kind of how I get most of my turmeric. It's an easy thing just to have this in a pitcher in the refrigerator and just have some whenever you want to go. It's dilute enough to where it's really not that messy. and yeah, super tasty, and it's nice cold. When I do use the fresh stuff, which I did more in the past, I would always use gloves and avoid like light fabrics, like this kind of stuff. When you are cooking with it, same thing though. You think about your light fabrics, it stains. It stains really strongly. So if you get things that are colored with it, they will probably stay that way. But add some turmeric in your life if you don't already. If the food is awesome, no drawbacks. Complete turmeric matrix supplements are a reasonable consideration for some symptoms. I wouldn't do those for those who are pregnant or lactating. And some medications, it's worth watching, but they can be a good thing for some ongoing conditions like depression, chronic pain, or liver function. So enjoy your turmeric, and I'll see you real soon. Take great care.